Hi, and welcome to the 5-Minute Check-In. Well, I'm very excited today because we're going to talk about, I think, one of the top publications that happened this year. And it's really looking at an important subject of social connectivity and loneliness and isolation, which drives a lot of healthcare in our country and around the world. We're really lucky today because the primary author on this article is joining us all the way from Scotland, from Glasgow, and that is Dr. Hamish, who is a primary care provider and a clinical research fellow at the University of Glasgow. Hamish, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, first of all, congratulations. What an amazing article and an important landmark article. I think will drive a lot of change in healthcare. So congratulations. Now, there's a lot of context for this discussion that I think some of us, particularly clinicians, may not really understand how you think about this subject. And you were studying two different categories within social connectivity. So give us the context for this. What's the language we need to learn a little bit?
Well, there are two main types of social connection we looked at. So one is subjective and the other objective. Subjective ones are things that people feel or like an internal feeling of loneliness, and more objective ones are more amenable to counting, such as how often people are in contact with friends and family.
So one is that internal sense, I'm lonely. The other is, hey, have you been to church? Did you have any guests? Do you live with somebody? More objective. So, and that is under the umbrella concept of social connectivity, but at least for this study.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So we looked at those two different types of social connection because both seem to be important for health.
Great. And apparently this is unique that someone had a data set that could look at both of these. So tell us about your study. Like, how many people did you look at, and a little more details about that?
Yeah, so we used a large data set called UK Biobank, which is a prospective cohort study of around 500,000 adults from across the UK. They were recruited between 2006 and 10 when they answered a bunch of different questions on health behaviors and their health generally, including questions around social connection, and their data from that study are linked to national registries, so we can see when people died and what they died from. So we use that large data set to look at the risk of dying, depending on what people's responses were for different types of social connection.
Got it. So the primary outcome, just so people know, there were two. The main one was all-cause mortality, and the second
Yes.
was cardiovascular health. Is that right? Cardiovascular
Cardiovascular
mortality.
mortality, yeah. So two mortality outcomes, exactly.
Okay, so this ginormous data set, within your public health system, and you're looking at all these different types of social connectivity and predicting mortality. So what were some of the major, findings of your study?
Yeah, so we looked at two subjective types, so the frequency of ability to confide and whether or not people often felt lonely or not, and three objective markers of social connection, frequency of friends and family visits, whether or not they lived alone, and whether or not they participated in weekly groups. So that's things like going to an adult education class or a social club. And we found that each of them are independently associated with both of the outcomes. So, even after mutual adjustment for these, as well as other common or potential confounding factors, we found that each of them have associations with mortality.
That's amazing. So, just the sense of someone telling you they have no one to confide in actually predicts that that person has a higher mortality. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Yeah. So that in our study we found that to be significantly associated with mortality. So that is a marker of isolation in a way, or a subjective isolation, if you want to think of it like that.
There was an interplay between the subjective and the objective. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so previous research, like you kind of mentioned at the beginning, has really lacked having both types of these social connection or measures of these social connections in the same data set. So they've not been able to look at both types together. But we were able to do that in our study. And if the participants reported one type of loneliness, they were at a higher risk of mortality. And if they reported one type of isolation, so a more objective measure, they were at even higher risk of mortality. But if they had one type of both, then they were even higher risk of mortality. So there was this kind of additive effect, that these two types of social disconnection, if you like, are not the same thing, and they can add on top of each other to increase mortality further.
Now, here in the US, and I'm sure over in the UK, screening for social determinants of health is a very, big issue for us now. A lot of us are doing that. We're doing that here at Common Spirit Health. If you were to think about this and say, okay, what would you, if you had the opportunity to like really screen for one or two things, and I gave you a little box on something that people would talk about, what would be those things that you would say, hey, we really need to be focused on these one or two issues, given this really a remarkable study?
Yeah, so I think that's a really actually tricky question because um, each of these questions, they could be, people could say, oh, that, it's an oversimplistic way of looking at really complex topics. However, one thing did stand out in this study, and that is maybe more easily standardizable and people could record it, and that was living alone. So whether or not people lived alone, that was associated, living alone was associated with a higher risk of mortality. And that seemed to interact with the other structural measures of social disconnection. So if people lived alone and they didn't participate in weekly group activity, or if they lived alone, and they never saw friends and families, that seemed to interact synergistically. So that multiplied their risk of mortality even higher. So living alone seemed to me a fairly simple thing that people could flag in the electronic medical record, that this person potentially could be at higher risk. Now, obviously, it gets complicated because you might not necessarily want to change people's living circumstances. People might like living alone and things like that. But
well, we're not fixing anything just yet. We're just identifying a problem. So
yeah, exactly.
got it. Well,
Yeah.
listen, I think this is such an important conversation. I think this will actually have us all thinking about like, well, do we need to start screening folks like this? And I think we do. And I think you've really done an amazing job adding to this science. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining us all the way from Scotland. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me and discussing my papers.
So thank you for joining me in this fascinating conversation about social connectivity. And I'll see you in 2 weeks, the next 5-minute check-in.